Chapter 10. Frankie. Frankie, wake up. We're almost home. Frances strolled to a sitting position as Margaret's voice penetrated her dreams. She rubbed her eyes and reached for Petey, who laughed. I'm up here on the big seat. He cried, you slept for a long, long, long time. Frances knelt to look ahead, saw the road curve leading upward past what looked like a forest. Jake half turned to glance at her, then looked back at the road. Cottonwood's near the water, but that's a good old oak hickory stand ahead. Lucky for us the drought hasn't hit the east part of Kansas too hard. Drought? Frances asked. It's been a dry year for folks who settled farther west. To keep a farm going, you need plenty of rain. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to soak the ground at the right times, help the crops grow to their peak. Margaret laughed. She sounded like a real farmer. Thought he was a farmer, Frances said in surprise. Mr. Cummings has 2 horses, Petey offered helpfully, so he must be a farmer. That's right, Petey, Jake said. I am. But I wasn't until 6 years ago. I taught at university. Margaret was a teacher at a primary school. We lived in New England, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to be exact. A group of us decided to come to Kansas to homestead. Frances was puzzled. She grabbed the side of the wagon to stay herself as the wagon dipped into a rut on the dirt road. Did you get tired of the work you were doing? She asked. No, Margaret said. Someday I'd love to teach again, but we are needed in Kansas. Do you know what slavery is, Frankie? Jake asked. Frances pictured the black man being led away in chains at the train station. Yes, she answered. Our country's national lawmakers worked out what they called a compromise, the Missouri Compromise. Gave us an equal number of states who accepted slavery and states who didn't. With a new free state and new territories added since then, the balance has shifted. The people who live in those territories want them to be free soil. The Southerners say no. The only way to succeed in making Kansas a free state is to become a homesteader and have a voice in Kansas policy. We came to Kansas because we believe slavery is wrong, Margaret said. Many people have sacrificed the comfortable lives they had in the East for this cause. Sacrifice, that word again. Frances nodded as Margaret spoke, but it was hard to understand. Frances was sure she'd rather be a teacher than a farmer, to work with books and learn from them, help others learn. That would be a wonderful job. She wondered if they missed the jobs they had in the land they'd come from. No, she couldn't understand. We'll soon be home, Margaret said. I know you're going to enjoy your welcome. Welcome? Frances asked. Some of our neighbors plan to come and meet our children, you. We're going to have quite a party. What's a party? Petey asked. You know, Frances said, like when Ma and Da would sing Irish songs, we'd drink hot tea with milk and sugar. Margaret smiled, and at this party our friends from all the nearby farms are going to come, each of them bringing home-cooked dishes and roasted meats, fruit pies. There'll be other children to play with, and games, and good conversation. We've never been to a party like that, Frances said. Oh. For a moment, Margaret looked distressed, and then she gave Petey a little hug and said, then this will be your first Kansas party. I can promise you'll enjoy it. The river was a thin ribbon of mirrored sunlight below, and to the east the horses turned off the dirt road into a narrower lane, and slowly tugged the wagon up a slight rise. Ahead, beyond a half-dozen wagons lined up in the lane, Frances could see a 2-story wood house, bright with white paint. Just to the right of it was a small log cabin, and to the left was a barn larger than the house. She sat up to study the buildings. The house was like a palace compared to the building in which she lived in New York. It was every bit as good as the house she had built in her dreams. Margaret's voice rose in a happy lilt as she explained, our house is new, a real house again. We've had 5 good years and 1 fair one of corn and wheat, and we were able to build, with pride she added, and we have our own well. We no longer have to carry water from the river. 2 boys dashed from the side of the house, stopping when they saw the wagon. Both were blonde, one was tall and one stocky. They were dressed much as Frances was, in collarless shirts, loose jackets, and trousers. The tall one stayed to wave while the other ran inside the house, calling out and banging the door behind him. As they pulled to a stop near the barn, the door to the house opened, and a flurry of children and adults ran outside. With them ran a large, shaggy-haired brown dog. A dog! Petey shouted. Is it yours? Yours, too, Jake said. His name's Barker. Jake held Frances's hand as she jumped from the wagon. Margaret was being hugged, and everyone was talking at once, exclaiming over Frances and Petey. 2, aren't you lucky? What wonderful boys! What are their names? Tell us about them. Petey, suddenly shy, dove for Frances and wrapped his arms around her neck. She was glad to hold him. It gave her a chance to duck her head again so that she wasn't facing everyone at once. She could peek through the corners of her eyes to examine them, especially the boys who seemed to be about her age, who were frankly examining her. What's the matter with you? Can't you say anything? A stocky boy asked Frances. Nothing to say, Frances answered back. Huh? You come from Boston? The boy said. Nah, Elton, the other said. Those orphans are from New York. He talks like someone who comes from Boston. He talks Irish. That's what you hear. It's Irish. And proud of it, Frances said, raising her head and attempting to stare him down. One of the women, who had tied a billowing white apron over her long homespun skirt, gave a little tap with the stocking boy's shoulder and said, Elton, Johnny, you mind your manners. Those boys will be your neighbors and friends. You make 'em feel at home. Margaret put an arm around Frances and Petey. I know you'd like to get acquainted and play with the other children for a while, so I'll show you your new home later. I can see it now, Frances said quickly, anxious to escape their strange faces. No, just have a good time for yourselves, Margaret said, as though she thought Frances were only trying to please. We'll have dinner on the table in a short time. I know you must be very hungry." Already the women were in a large table covered with white cloths. Margaret bustled off to join them. Some of the men went with Jake to store the wagon and help with the horses. "Want to play tag?" a small girl asked Petey. Without a word to Frances, Petey wiggled out of her arms and raced off to the younger children, all of them shrieking at the top of their lungs. Barker, living up to his name, ran with them. Johnny and Elton ran off too, shoving, poking, and yelling at each other, ignoring Frances. For this she was thankful, but some of the women began darting little concerned glances at her, so she went after the boys, wanting only to get away from all the people. As she rounded the corner of the house, she discovered she was alone. Enjoying the silence, she gladly leaned against the nearby elm tree. The Cummings land was beautiful. The house overlooked a large meadow dotted with trees, a few of them still green, many bright in orange and yellow leaves. To one side lay a field of black soil, rising in rows and low mounds separated by shallow valleys, cleared except for the scattering of dried stalks. Next to the back of the house was a garden, and she could see rounds of orange and yellow poking through the green vines. Were they squash? Pumpkins? She'd eaten squash and pumpkin, both, but she never imagined what they looked like before they arrived in huge piles at the greengrocer's shop. If only she could show this to Megan and Ma. She pushed the thought that would lead to tears from her mind. A bright spot of color lay on the patch of grass near the feet, caught her eye, and she bent to pick it up. It was a doll made of cloth. Frances had never seen anything like it. It was so different from the elegant dolls with china faces and silk dresses in the store windows of New York. The homely doll, with its embroidered eyes and smile and hair of tangled brown yarn, went straight to Frances's heart. For an instant she held the doll close. "What you doing with that doll?" the mocking voice came from behind her. Frances whirled around to face Elton and Johnny. "Never saw one like this before," Frances mumbled and dropped it to the ground. Elton grinned. "You dropped your dolly. You ought to pick it up before it gets dirty." He grabbed Frances's shoulder and pushed down hard. But Frances was no stranger to bullies. Having learned well from Mike how to protect herself, she reacted instinctively. Twisting into Elton, she butted him in the stomach, hooked a foot behind him, and jerked. Elton landed on his back in the dirt. "What's going on, boys?" A woman who had come around the corner of the house wiped her hands on the apron and stared at them suspiciously. "You're not fighting, are you?" "No, ma'am," Frances said, "just having a little fun." The woman looked a little dubious, but she said, "Dinner's ready. You can wash it by the back door." As the woman walked away, Frances reached down and grabbed Elton's elbow and pulled him to his feet. Dusting him off much harder than necessary, she murmured, "Want to talk any more about dollies, or you got enough sense to talk about something else?" "What'd you get so mad for?" the boy answered. "I was just making fun." Johnny folded his arms and praised Frances. "You learned to fight like that in New York City?" "It's where I'm from," Frances said. "How'd you do that thing with your feet?" Johnny asked. "That was fast. Can you show me how to do it?" "Children, everyone, come to dinner," one of the women called. "Come on, let's eat." Elton shoved Johnny so hard he nearly knocked him off his feet. He was off in a moment, Johnny right behind him. Frances relaxed once more, leaning against the tree and laying out a long, slow breath. That was close. In the future, she'd have to be more careful. Frances splashed her face and neck with cold water from the basin, dried herself with a towel, then hung it on the hook of a wooden bench. The water felt good, and she realized how hungry she'd become. She walked around the house to join the others. Petey was sitting on the grass with some other children, a tin plate between his legs. A short, plump woman with smiling eyes greeted Frances, propelled her toward the table, and handed her a plate. Frances struggled to remember the woman's name. Mrs. Mueller, Johnny's mother. That was it. "Help yourself, Frankie," Mrs. Mueller said. What a feast. At first, Frances could only stare at the baskets and plates that covered the table. She'd never seen so much food in one place. At the far end was brown bread and lots of honey and butter near them. Nearby were bowls and pans piled with meats and vegetables she didn't recognize, but they were fragrant, and the smell of them caused her stomach to rumble. Mrs. Mueller patted Frances's shoulder and said, "Maybe some of our food is strange to you, but I think you'll like it. Over there is a brown dish of game bird pie." She named one dish after another: cured and roasted pork hocks, pickled carrots, Indian cornbread pudding, which rose with a tantalizing smell of molasses, cold sliced potatoes seasoned with sauce and bacon drippings and onions, and squash pie, especially from Margaret, she finished proudly. "It's a real favorite for New Englanders." "Are you from New England, too?" Frances asked. Mrs. Mueller shook her head. "No, my husband and I sold our land even before these good friends arrived. We lived just over the border in Nebraska territory." The laugh lines around her eyes crinkled as she giggled and whispered, "But I didn't forget my own favorite, the potatoes. It's my mother's recipe." Frances continued to stare at the food. Would her brothers and sisters be eating this well? She was greedy to taste the fine dishes, but guiltily remembered the watery cabbage and mealy potatoes that Mom would have to eat. But Mrs. Mueller heaped a pile for Frances and pushed it into her hands. "Eat well," she said. "You need a few good meals to build up those young muscles." So the children had carried their plates and forks to the front porch, where they sat in a row, dangling their legs over the edge, intent on the good food they were eating. The men had taken their plates inside the house, and Frances could hear the low, comforting rumble of the deep voices. The women didn't sit still for long anywhere, but bustled back and forth between the kitchen and the table, sometimes chatting to fill their plates, and sometimes stopping to fill their plates and stand, eating and chatting for a few moments. Frances didn't know where to take her plate. The boys were too rough. She couldn't sit with the girls. They wouldn't want her anyway. Thankful that no one was watching her, she slipped into the parlor where the men were seated and sat on the floor near the side of the fireplace. It was a warm, inviting room, and Frances had a strange sense of belonging there. As she looked around, she understood why. The embroidered pillows on the chairs and the lace curtains in the windows came from the house she had built in her dreams. It was a perfect, except for one thing. Her family was not there with her. The men began to speak of Abraham Lincoln. He's not much to look at, being a long beanpole of a man, but he's a mighty fine orator, Mr. Mueller said. You heard him speak? The younger man asked. Yes, and met him too. Last year he came to St. Joseph on the side-wheeler boat Emile on his way to the Council Bluffs. You know what it means if Lincoln's elected, someone said, and the conversation turned to the possibility of war among the states and the terrible bloody raids made over the past few years along the Kansas-Missouri border by both pro-slavery Missourians and Kansas abolitionist jayhawkers. Lincoln will do away with slavery, Jake said. The others agreed. The conversation was interesting, but the plate of food with its mingled spicy, sweet, and pungent fragrances demanded Frances's attention. She decided to try a bite of the pie first, and didn't stop till she devoured every crumb. And she attacked the rest of the meal, forgetting her manners, and stuffed herself full of pork and potatoes and some strange but delicious thing she couldn't name. It was only when the plate was clean and she had licked it, as though she had licked it, and her stomach round and tight against her trousers, that Frances leaned back against the wall and fully paid attention to what the men were saying. Someone was talking about the Underground Railroad. She imagined a train with tracks that rolled and rocked along the caves and caverns. Till the Fugitive Slave Act's abolished, the Underground Railroad's the only answer, Mr. Miller said. There was silence for a moment, and a man with gray in his hair spoke up. Don't forget, Klaus, taking part in helping slaves escape is against the law, has severe penalties. How can you balance penalties against helping a man gain his freedom? You'd risk going to prison? A young man leaned forward and spoke earnestly, holding up a hand to interrupt Mr. Mueller. Wait, think for a moment before another word is said. We're all neighbors and good friends here. We can trust one another. We still should not be too outspoken. We're all working within the law to help Kansas become a free state. That's the first step. Process is slow, Mr. Mueller grumbled. The man's tone became more deliberate. None of us knows anyone who is part of the Underground Railroad, and let's keep it that way. Jake stood up. More coffee? Klaus, William, Henry, let me fill your cups. A young man bounced to his feet. Real coffee and roasted rye. Well, this is quite a party. Ah, Mr. Mueller said, his mood changing to match the others. Wait till Christmas season, that will be a party. Frida will bake a Christmas cake big enough to feed the whole countryside. With plenty of raisins, someone asked, laughing. Yes, raisins. Henry will expect you to bring your fiddle. I'd bring it even if you hadn't asked me to. A few minutes later, the young man put down his cup and said, Time for me to collect my family, prepare to head home. Also for me, another said. By this time, the men were on their feet. Some of the women were hurrying into the house, and Frances made her way to the kitchen. She could never have imagined a kitchen like this one. It was a large square room with a huge fireplace at one end, a row of long-handled iron skillets, 2 large kettles, ladles, a toasting fork, and some other cooking tools hung on pegs over the fireplace. And next to the cooking hearth stood a cupboard with double doors. An ornate, round wood stove was at one side of the kitchen, a cloth-covered table and some ladder-backed chairs on the other, and near the center of the room was a sturdy work table, and against the inside wall were shelves laden with stoneware jars and crocks of all sizes, tinware, and kitchen tools that Frances had never seen. The room was cozy with the odors of food and the leftovers, which were now being parceled out among the women and tucked into cloth-covered baskets. Oh, Ma, Frances thought, you wouldn't believe this wondrous kitchen unless you could see it with your own eyes. It hurt too much to think of Ma. Frances knew she had to get busy to force her mind to go in another direction. With a folded towel to protect her hands, she swung the iron crane from inside the fireplace, removed a steaming kettle with its pot hook, powering the water into 2 large metal bowls that had been set from one of the tables. The youngest woman, Mrs. Busby, thanked Frances. Into one of the bowls, Mrs. Busby stirred a dollop of soap from the jar of scrapings and water that sat on the windowsill, and then added a small amount of cold water to both bowls. Frances immediately dumped a tray of used forks and knives into the soapy water and began to rub them clean. Mrs. Busby's eyes opened wide in fixed surprise. Where'd you learn to wash dishes like that? She asked. Puzzled, Frances frowned. Am I doing it wrong? Oh, no, Mrs. Busby said. It's just that you don't often find boys willing to do women's work. Frances fumbled for the right words to cover her mistake. If it needs to be done, what difference should it make who does it? She tucked her head and scrubbed hard at the utensils. My, Mrs. Busby said, I like the way you think, young man. She picked up a bleached flour sack and began to dry the utensils that had been washed and rinsed. Gotta be more careful, Frances murmured to herself, so when Margaret came to shoo Frances out to play with the other boys, she went without protest. As she left the kitchen, Frances heard Mrs. Busby say to Margaret, Frankie's a gentle boy, so she deliberately found Elton and picked a quarrel. They pummeled each other and rolled in the dirt until 2 of the men pulled them apart. Just having fun, Elton mumbled to his father. That right, Frankie? Jake asked. Frances shook her head. No, but the fight was my fault. I pushed him. Mr. Mueller laughed loudly. An honest answer. The boys are angry now. In a few minutes, they'll be friends. Frances held a hand to Elton. "Shake on it," she said. Grudgingly, Elton did. The sun dipped low, red, in the western sky, and it was time for the party to end. Within a few moments, Elton and his family were on their wagon, heading for their own farm. A few families who had tarried shouted their goodbyes, too, until the Muellers were the only guests who remained. "They'll stay the night," Margaret explained to Frances, "because the ride back to their house would take too long. If you have no objections, we'll offer your beds to Klaus and Frida, and we'll put Carl and Matthew in with Peter. We'll lay pallets on the floor in front of the kitchen fireplace for you, Johnny and Fred." "House full of boys," Mrs. Mueller laughed, waggling a finger at them. "And you must all go to sleep without chattering late in the night, because we have to rise early to begin our drive home." As darkness fell, quilts and pillows were carried to the kitchen, piled on the floor near the fireplace. Barker curled up under the table by the wall as though to protect the spot that belonged to him. Frances glanced around the kitchen. It was so different from home. It lived with only one room, and all the children shared a big bed. For just an instant, Frances yearned with all her heart for her own home, her brothers and sisters and Ma, and she sharply reminded herself this place was her home now, and she would have to do her best to accept that fact, and there was no turning back. Margaret paused and looked at Frances. "Oh," she said, "I didn't think. You and Peter will want a bath after your long journey. Well, we can bring the tub into the kitchen and take care of that as soon as I have some water heated." She picked up the kettle and headed toward the large pottery crock of water. Frances stumbled in front of Margaret, blocking her way. "No," she cried. She tried to talk calmly. "Petey's much too tired," she said. She faked an open-mouthed yawn. "So am I. Could we wait till tomorrow?" Frances held her breath in surprise until Margaret shrugged and said, "If you'd rather." "I'd much rather," Frances insisted. Margaret glanced at Petey, who was almost asleep on his feet, too tired of protest being taken from Frances and tucked into a strange bed. "Suppose you're right," Margaret said. She scooped Petey into her arms, and Mrs. Mueller gathered Carl and Matthew and headed for the stairs. Fred, who was the younger version of his brother Johnny, immediately pulled off his square-toed boots, his stockings, his trousers, and dove into one of the pallets. "Ha!" he shouted. "I got the best spot." "That's what you think," Johnny says. He winked at Frances. "You got the quilt with the itchy, nasty bed bugs." Fred scrambled out of the quilt so fast he kicked the pallet apart. "Bed bugs? Where?" he demanded. Johnny laughed loudly, and Fred angrily tried to make his bed again, muttering, "You think you're so funny, but that was dumb. You're a dumb, stinking old skunk bottom." Frances returned Johnny's grin. "I'm still hungry," Johnny said. "Frances, I'm going to get an apple. You want one too?" Frances took the apple that Johnny held out to her and followed him outside, sitting next to him in the stoop in the darkness. "How old are you?" Johnny asked. 13, Frances said. Johnny sounded smug. "I'm 14. "I'm near 14. "I'm near 15. He paused, taking a large bite from the apple. "My pa and your new pa are best friends." The apple cracked as Frances bit into it. Tart juice sprayed her face, and she wiped it away with the back of one hand. "We used to live in Pennsylvania, near New York, where you come from," Johnny said. "But I don't remember it much, because I wasn't very old when we moved to Nebraska. You like traveling on a train?" Sort of not," Frances mumbled around a mouthful of apple. She swallowed hard and said, "First it was different, all the new things to see. Never saw a farm before. But trains stop a lot to get water and wood. They rock back and forth and rattle. It's hard to sleep." "Sounds boring." "It was kind of boring, except when we had to stop to put out a brush fire, when some of the outlaws robbed the train." "Huh?" Johnny whirled to stare at Frances, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You're making that up." "Am not." "And tell me. First tell me about the outlaws." "The fire first," Frances said. "Then I'll tell you about the outlaws later." Much later, she thought. She didn't want to tell him about Mike and what he had done. To make her the story about the fire last longer, she put in everything she could remember, even the way the hot sparks shot from the smokestack on the train. As she finished, Johnny let out a long whistle. "You're good at telling a tale. Tell about the outlaws now." Frances shook her head. "I'll tell you some other time. I'm ready to go to sleep." She stood up and walked around the stoop to the bench. Once more she washed her face and hands. Johnny watched her. "How come you're washing up again? No one said you had to." "We always washed up before going to bed. That was one of Ma's rules." "Your Ma, but—" "Oh." Johnny quickly looked away and turned and threw open the kitchen door. Only the banked coals in the fireplace lit the kitchen. Frances took off her jacket, boots, and stockings and climbed under the quilts as far away from Fred and Johnny as she could get. She pulled the quilt up to her chin. It was warm and cozy, and she burrowed deeply into it. She squeezed her eyes shut. Jake and Mr. Mueller were still talking in low tones in the parlor, and the house was still except for the creak-crack of the wooden stairs as the men went to bed. The house was filled with people, yet Frances never felt so lonely. When would she see Megan again, and Peg, and Danny, and Mike? Now, though she tried to fight them back, hot tears spilled down her cheeks, and she gave a loud sniffle. She heard Johnny turn toward her. "Ma said you had to leave your brothers and sisters," he whispered. "If I had to leave Matt and Carl, even old Froggy Fred over there, I'd cry too." Frances sniffled again and murmured, "I didn't mean to cry." And Pa said it's all right to cry sometimes. He told me he cried once when he was a grown man and right in front of everybody. He cried because he saw a man get shot and killed. Frances wiped her eyes. "Sorry I woke you." "You didn't wake me," Johnny said. "I couldn't sleep. Thinking of that fine story you told about the fire." There was a long pause, and Johnny said, "Frankie, glad we're friends." "Me too," Frances said, surprised that she really was glad. The quilt at the far end rose in a quivering hump. "Close your big, ugly mouths," Fred growled. "I'm trying to sleep." Frances stuffed a fist in her mouth, suppressing a giggle which turned itself into a yawn. The Cummings were good people, and at least Petey was with her. She wouldn't let herself think of anything else. Frances yawned again and slid headfirst into sleep.